All right, strap in, everyone. We're going deep on this one. Joe Rogan, episode 2255. His guest, Mark Zuckerberg. And you guys sent in this transcript. It's wild. We're covering free speech, the ins and outs of social media, and get this, Zuckerberg is a jujitsu fanatic.
It really is a fascinating pairing. Rogan, he's all about no filters, saying what you think. And then there's Zuckerberg running Meta, a company, let's be honest, that gets a lot of flack for maybe filtering a little too much. But this conversation, I think, gives us a glimpse into how Zuckerberg's own views have changed, especially with all the controversy around Facebook.
Right, and that's what makes this deep dive so important. We're going to break down how his stance on free speech has shifted over time, how governments are putting pressure on these huge platforms, and how on earth they even attempt to moderate content at such a massive scale. Plus, we'll get into Zuckerberg's love for martial arts and what that might tell us about how he approaches.
Well, everything. One of the biggest things that jumped out at me was Zuckerberg admitting that his early idealistic view of free expression, well, it's been put to the test. He started Facebook believing in this free flow of information, but the last decade, especially the 2016 election and the pandemic, really shook things up.
Big time. He even says that back during the Trump years, he might have leaned too hard on critiques from the media, which is kind of ironic given that trust in mainstream media was declining at the same time.
Exactly. And that shift in how people get their news changes the game completely. Less trust in traditional media. Platforms like Facebook become the place to go for information, which then shines a giant spotlight on content moderation and, let's face it, the near impossible task of getting it right every single time.
Zuckerberg doesn't try to hide how big of a challenge that is either. He throws out this stat. It's kind of mind-blowing. Over 3.2 billion people use Meta's services daily. Think about it. Cat videos, political arguments, everything in between, all happening at once. Even Rogan admits moderating that volume of content, that's got to be insanely hard.
Yeah, it's easy to sit back and criticize those moderation decisions. But when you realize how much content is flying through these platforms every second, mistakes, unfortunately, are gonna happen.
He even tells this story about terrorist content that illustrates this perfectly.
Great. He's talking about how trying to wipe out all terrorist content, their algorithms can end up flagging totally innocent accounts because they're set to be super sensitive.
So you can imagine how frustrating it would be. Your account gets shut down out of nowhere, no explanation. Makes you think about what we're willing to sacrifice, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Where's the line between taking down genuinely harmful stuff and accidentally silencing people who've done nothing wrong? Finding that balance is a constant struggle.
And then you throw in the pressure from governments, especially during COVID. Zuckerberg reveals that the Biden administration was pushing Facebook to remove info about vaccine side effects, even if that information was true. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it definitely brings up questions about who has the power here. Rogan makes the argument that governments aren't exactly thrilled about the shift social media has caused. They've lost some control over the narrative, and that can have big consequences, like when it comes to elections.
Zuckerberg seems pretty frustrated by it, too. He sees the U.S. government being adversarial towards its own tech companies. He points to those massive EU fines, investigations led by people like Jim Jordan. It's creating tension, for sure.
But what's interesting is Zuckerberg thinks the U.S. government should be an ally to its tech companies, especially with the competition from China heating up. He wants a more collaborative approach, the government actively supporting innovation in tech.
It's a complicated issue, no doubt. But what's clear is the relationship between tech and governments is constantly evolving, and social media's growing influence is at the heart of it. Now let's get into the nuts and bolts of how they try to moderate all this content. We talked about the volume, but they're also using some pretty specific strategies to tackle misinformation.
One big change is they're moving away from depending solely on those third-party fact-checkers. They're going for a more community-driven approach, similar to what Twitter does with community notes.
So instead of having just a handful of experts deciding what's true or not, they're tapping into the knowledge of all their users, providing context, adding info to potentially misleading posts.
Zuckerberg's argument is that this way builds more trust. It's transparent because it relies on a consensus, not just a few people's opinions, which could be biased. It's an interesting experiment for sure. We'll have to see how it affects the spread of misinformation on these platforms.
And then there's the challenge of striking that balance between promoting inclusivity and allowing for open discussion. Zuckerberg even tells this story about Pete Buttigieg's views on women in combat roles.
Right, under Facebook's old policies that would have been flagged, potentially advocating for excluding a protected group.
It seems like those policies, while they had good intentions, sometimes ended up backfiring. They might have actually stifled important debates on social issues. Zuckerberg seems to be realizing that they need more flexibility, more nuance to find that sweet spot between inclusivity and free speech.
This whole deep dive really shows how complex content moderation is. It's not as simple as remove bad stuff. It's about constantly adapting to changing social norms, political pressures, and of course the technology itself.
And speaking of adapting, we've got to talk about something a little lighter, but still pretty revealing about Zuckerberg, his love for jiu-jitsu and MMA. It might seem random, but it actually gives us a glimpse into how he handles challenges, both in his personal life and at work.
The story about his wife, Priscilla Chan, encouraging him to get back into fighting after he tore his ACL, that was really interesting. It wasn't just about getting in shape. It was about this mindset of discipline, being resilient, pushing past your limits.
He even jokes that his team at work was bracing themselves for a flood of emails while he was recovering. Sounds like that competitive spirit is part of everything he does.
Yeah.
What do you think? Could that intensity be a double-edged sword?
That's a great question. It's definitely admirable, but you gotta wonder, if it goes unchecked, could that lead to burnout or trouble letting others take charge? We might find out more about that as we get into Zuckerberg's leadership style in the next part of our deep dive. Welcome back to the deep dive. We left off talking about Zuckerberg's intensity, always pushing himself. So let's pick up there and see what he has to say about the future of tech, especially this whole idea of balancing innovation with regulation.
Yeah, I was struck by his argument that with tech moving so fast, especially AI, we need a more flexible approach to regulation. He seemed to be saying that heavy-handed government intervention could actually stifle innovation and hurt the U.S.'s ability to compete globally. Do you see that tension, that push and pull between progress and oversight?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a valid concern. He uses this analogy of a starting pistol. You know, how regulations often lag behind the development of new technologies. By the time the rules are in place, the tech has already moved on. It's like a constant game of catch-up.
And he even brings up how well-intentioned regulations can sometimes backfire, like GDPR, the European Data Privacy Law. It was meant to protect user data, but it also created obstacles for smaller startups, making it harder for them to compete with the big tech companies.
That's a great point. It shows how regulations can sometimes unintentionally favor the big guys, the ones who have the resources to navigate all those complex legal frameworks. Meanwhile, it hinders the new players, stifles competition. It goes back to Zuckerberg's idea that we need a more nuanced approach, one that considers the long-term effects on innovation.
It seems like he's advocating for more collaboration, governments and tech companies working together, creating guidelines that protect consumers but also encourage innovation. He even suggests that governments could incentivize companies to develop AI responsibly. Do you think that would work?
It's a fascinating idea. Instead of just restrictions, governments could actually encourage ethical AI development. Think about tax breaks, research funding, or even streamlining the regulatory process for companies that prove they're committed to doing things the right way. It's a more proactive approach, maybe shaping AI development in a positive direction.
This brings us to another big part of their conversation, the ethical considerations around AI. Zuckerberg doesn't shy away from the potential dangers, the risks of bias, discrimination, AI being used for harmful purposes.
He seems particularly worried about AI perpetuating existing societal biases, especially if the data used to train these systems is already biased. It could lead to unfair outcomes in hiring, loan applications, even the criminal justice system. He really stresses fairness, transparency, accountability when it comes to AI development.
And he keeps emphasizing the need for human oversight throughout the whole process, developing AI, using it. Humans need to be in control, making sure these systems align with our values, making sure they don't end up hurting individuals or society as a whole.
Right. It's easy to get swept up in the excitement about AI, see it as a solution to everything. But we have to remember, it's a tool. And like any tool, it can be misused. Humans have to take responsibility, guide its development, make sure it's used ethically.
This leads to a bigger conversation about the tech industry's role in shaping society. Zuckerberg seems to recognize the immense power and influence these companies have and the responsibility that comes with it.
He seems to believe that tech companies have an obligation to use their resources, their expertise, to solve societal problems. Climate change, poverty, access to education. He paints this picture of tech as a force for good, improving lives, creating a more just world.
He also keeps coming back to transparency and accountability. He's urging tech companies to be more open about how they make decisions, especially the ones that affect society. It's like he's calling for a more collaborative approach, where tech companies, policymakers, academics, even the public are all working together to shape the future of tech in a way that benefits everyone.
It really highlights how the relationship between the tech industry and society is changing. As technology becomes even more intertwined with our lives, we need to have these open and honest conversations about the benefits, the risks, about the role we want tech to play in shaping our future.
It's definitely complicated, but it's a conversation we can't ignore. And speaking of changing landscapes, let's shift gears for a minute. Let's talk about Zuckerberg's perspective on the metaverse, the future of virtual and augmented reality. This is where things get really interesting, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. This is where we see that visionary side of Zuckerberg. He clearly sees the metaverse as the next big step for the internet, a more immersive digital world where people can connect, work, learn, and play in ways we haven't even imagined yet. He talks about a future where we move seamlessly between the physical and digital worlds using VR and AR.
He actually describes being able to attend a virtual concert with friends from all over the world, or working together on a project in a shared virtual space. This isn't just science fiction either. Meta is pouring resources into making this vision a reality.
And it's not just about fun and games. Zuckerberg thinks the metaverse could completely change education and training. Imagine learning history by virtually visiting ancient Rome, or practicing a surgical procedure in a realistic VR simulation. The possibilities are endless.
But like with any new tech, there are concerns. Some people worry about the metaverse becoming even more addictive, more isolating than social media already is. Others are worried about privacy and security, in a virtual world where your every move could be tracked. What do you make of those concerns?
They're valid concerns, for sure, and Zuckerberg acknowledges them. He says we need to be careful, plan for responsible and ethical development of the metaverse. Privacy, security, accessibility. These need to be top priorities from the very beginning to make sure the metaverse is inclusive and beneficial for everyone.
He also talks about the importance of interoperability, making sure different virtual worlds can connect easily so users aren't trapped in one platform. It goes back to his critique of Apple's closed system. He really believes in open standards, collaboration being essential for driving innovation.
It's an ambitious vision, for sure, potentially transformative. It raises some fundamental questions about the future of human interaction, about the nature of reality even, and how technology will continue to shape our lives.
It feels like we're just at the beginning of this conversation, and it's going to keep evolving as the technology gets better and we understand its potential more fully.
But even in this metaverse, the human element can't be ignored. And this is where Zuckerberg's passion for jiu-jitsu comes in again. It's not just a hobby. It's a way for him to connect, to challenge himself, build discipline and resilience.
It's a good reminder that even in a world where tech is everywhere, human connection is still fundamental.
Exactly. And from this conversation, you can really see how much he values those benefits of training, the camaraderie within the martial arts community, pushing himself beyond his comfort zone.
It gives us a different perspective on Zuckerberg, a side we don't always see. And it helps us understand what drives him, his vision for the future, a little bit better. This deep dive has been quite a journey. From free speech and content moderation to the metaverse and the importance of human connection. What are your biggest takeaways so far?
Honestly, I'm struck by how broadly Zuckerberg thinks. We've covered so much. Regulating AI, building a more ethical tech industry, his personal commitment to growth and self-improvement. It's obvious he's wrestling with some huge questions about technology's role in society. And following his thought process has been fascinating. But we're not done yet. There's still more to unpack. Especially his thoughts on the future of AI, the challenges of building a responsible tech industry, and his vision for a more connected world.
Let's dive into those final insights in Part 3. We'll explore how Zuckerberg's personal journey has shaped his views on technology's impact and what he believes it will take to create a more equitable, more promising future. All right, welcome back. We've covered so much ground already in our deep dive into Zuckerberg's conversation with Joe Rogan. Let's get into what Zuckerberg had to say about building a responsible and ethical tech industry. This is where I think his own experiences and how his views have changed get really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. He talks about how, at first, he really believed in the power of free expression, but over the years, that's been challenged. And it's led him to a more, nuanced understanding of content moderation and the need for clear guidelines.
He really pushes for transparency from tech companies, especially when they make those tough calls about taking down content or flagging it, those decisions that always seem to cause controversy. He says companies need to be more upfront about how their algorithms work and give users a way to appeal if they feel like a decision was unfair.
He even suggests that maybe independent groups, like oversight boards, could help hold tech companies accountable for what's on their platforms, kind of like another layer of checks and balances.
It's tricky, right? And Zuckerberg seems to think it's not just the tech companies that need to be held accountable. He says governments, educators, individuals. We all have a responsibility to create a healthier online environment, to fight back against misinformation.
Right. It's a good reminder that building a responsible tech industry isn't just about code and algorithms. It's about promoting ethical awareness, encouraging people to think critically. And that goes for the people inside those companies and society as a whole.
He also talks about the importance of diversity and inclusion within the tech industry. He says having a workforce that reflects the diversity of society, that's key for building products and services that really meet everyone's needs.
He sees a need for more opportunities for people from underrepresented groups in tech and for tackling those systemic barriers that have kept them out of the field. Do you think having more diverse perspectives within these companies would actually lead to better products and services?
It makes sense, right?
Yeah.
If the people building the tech don't represent the people actually using it, they're going to miss things.
Exactly. And beyond fairness and representation, diverse teams are just more creative, more effective.
This conversation also highlights how technology can be used to actually empower people and communities. Zuckerberg believes technology can be a force for good, connecting people, spreading knowledge, opening up new opportunities.
He gives examples of tech being used to support democratic movements, fight poverty, even improve access to healthcare. It seems like he sees technology as a tool to solve problems, create a more just world.
It's definitely an optimistic view. It makes you think about how we can use all this power, all this technology to really make a difference. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's important to be both optimistic and realistic. Technology is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. It's our responsibility to make sure it's used to build a better future. And that brings us back to Zuckerberg's own journey, especially his dedication to personal growth, always trying to improve himself.
His passion for jiu-jitsu comes to mind. It's not just about physical fitness, it's about pushing his boundaries, embracing challenges, always trying to learn and get better.
He talks about how training has taught him discipline, resilience, and even humility. Those qualities benefit him everywhere, not just in martial arts.
It's a side of him we don't always see. He's known for being driven, ambitious, but this shows a willingness to be a beginner, to face those challenges head on, to constantly strive to be better.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into Mark Zuckerberg's conversation with Joe Rogan, what are the key takeaways for you?
I think the biggest takeaway is that we're living in a time where technology is changing everything so fast, and its impact is only going to get bigger. And the responsibility to shape how tech is developed and used, that's on all of us, not just the tech leaders. We need to understand the ethical implications, the potential benefits and risks, and figure out how to make sure technology leads to a future that's more just, more equitable, and better for everyone.
Absolutely. And as we figure all that out, as we navigate this crazy landscape, we have to remember human connection, pushing ourselves to grow, striving for excellence, those things are still essential. Technology can be an incredible force for good, but it's up to us to make sure it's used the right way.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful.